You must have been praying for me because I made it through that day. I want to tell you, without prayer, I wouldn't have made it.
Thank you. Well, we think it works.
It's working.
Prayer and the orchestra spirit all together. Thank you. Stay here.
Just delighted that someone
Thank you.
I think it's going to
Thank you and welcome everyone for coming. Many of us are fortunate to know Hedrick Smith as a neighbor, a friend, a community member, and a distinguished journalist. Hedrick is here tonight to speak on The Dream at Risk, based on his new book, Who Stole the American Dream. We thank him for making time in his busy tour schedule to be here today. Mr. Smith's career began in print journalism in the 1950s with summer jobs as a cub reporter for the Greenville, South Carolina News. After graduating from William College, doing graduate work at Oxford University, and serving 3 years in the U.S. Air Force, Mr. Smith joined United Press International from 1959 to 1962. In his 26 years with the New York Times, Mr. Smith covered Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Struggle, the Vietnam War in Saigon, the Middle East conflict from Cairo, the Cold War with stints in both Moscow and Washington, and 6 American presidents and their administrations. In 1971, as chief diplomatic correspondent, he was a member of the Pulitzer Prize winning team that produced the Pentagon Papers series. In 1974, he won the Pulitzer Prize for international reporting from Russia and Eastern Europe. His book, The Russians, based on his years as New York Times Moscow bureau chief from 1971 to 1974, was a #1 American bestseller. And his next book, The Power Game, How Washington Works, was also a major bestseller. For PBS, since 1989, Hedrick Smith has created 26 primetime specials and miniseries on such varied topics as terrorism, Wall Street, the global economy, Walmart, Enron, tax evasion, education reform, healthcare, and the frontline program, Poisoned Waters. Mr. Smith's documentary work has won many of television's major awards. 2 of his frontline programs won Emmys, and 2 others were nominated twice. Twice he has won or shared the Columbia DuPont Gold Baton or Grand Prize, emblematic of the year's best public affairs programs on American television. Hedrick will speak for approximately 45 minutes, and afterwards we will have a short question and answer session. As time is limited, we ask that questions be brief and to the point. At 6:30, we invite you to a reception and book signing at Darville's Bookstore. Thank you again for coming and supporting Crosswords, and I'd like to extend a warm welcome to Hedrick Smith.
Well, thank you, Jenny, and thank you all for coming. I have to tell you, it doesn't get any better for an author than this. Well, look where we are. Look out the window. To stand up and talk about your book in front of a bunch of your friends in your hometown, it's just unbelievable. I'm a little overwhelmed. It's a treat to be able to do this. I need to tell you, and I'll get to it in a moment, that this actually is a book that I set out to write. But before I do that, I'd like to share with you sort of the readings of the day. One reading of the day comes from Peanuts. It's that Charlie Brown cartoon where Lucy has set up a table in the backyard and says, "Psychiatry, 1 cent." And you know who shows up, Charlie. He puts his penny down, he says, "Lucy, I need help." And she says, "Well, Charlie, I'd be willing to give you advice, but before I do, think of life as a voyage on a great ocean liner. Are you one of those people who takes your deck chair to the bow and looks into the future to see where you're going? Or are you one of those people who takes your deck chair to the back, to the stern, and sees where you've come from?" And Charlie thinks a minute, scratches his head, and he said, "You know, Lucy, I'm having trouble getting my chair unfolded." That's sort of a lighthearted introduction to my chat today. I'm really having a job here with this. I've only done television for 50 hours and all that kind of stuff. Keeping the mic on today is going to be a challenge. But I want to share with you a couple of comments from some very wise people who put our dilemma a little bit differently from that. One of them is Justice Brandeis, who went on the Supreme Court. Before that, was an advisor to President Wilson. And he said something very profound that's pertinent for America today. We must make our choice, said Brandeis. We may have democracy, or we may have wealth concentrated in the hands of a few. But we can't have both. And then a comment from John W. Gardner, who was a cabinet secretary for Lyndon Johnson, and then the head of Common Cause for a long time, the Public Advocacy Group. And listen to this, it's just gorgeous, the eloquence and the pertinence of it. We are treading the edge of a precipice here. Civilizations die of disenchantment. If enough people doubt their society, the whole venture falls apart. We must never let anger, fashionable cynicism, or political partisanship blur our vision on that point. We must not despair of the Republic. What got me started on this book, and I need to tell you, I actually started work on this book here on Orcas about 3 years ago, after the Puget Sound, Chesapeake Bay, Poison Waters PBS documentary was on the air. And I was troubled about the housing crisis, and I didn't quite understand how it all got going. I wanted to get to the bottom of the subprime crisis, try to understand the impact, how it had such a profound impact on our economy. And as I dug into it, I got into offshoring of jobs, I got into retirement, I got into one subject after another. And I actually began with the question that is the title of today's speech, The Dream at Risk. Well, that's the book I started out to write. That's the book I signed a contract for with my publisher, The Dream at Risk. I wanted to understand how we had gone from an era in America where we had middle-class prosperity, middle-class power, and effective bipartisanship in our politics. And it moved to an era of polarized partisan politics and gridlock, of starkly unequal democracy, of gaping inequalities in our income and our economy, and a middle class that was stuck in the rut. How did that happen? How had we moved from being a society of shared prosperity, a society of unity or a sense of commonality, to two Americas, to a society that was divided, deeply divided, primarily by class, but also by other things, ideology and power. Now, it's fashionable now to say that this concern about the division of America into two Americas is the preoccupation and the concern of liberal economists like Paul Krugman of Princeton or Joe Stiglitz of Columbia. But let me tell you that many conservative thinkers are troubled by it too. And I'll read one more quote. This one from Charles Murray, conservative sociologist and thinker from the American Enterprise Institute. This is a quote from him. America is coming apart at the seams. Not seams of race or ethnicity, but of class. Murray voices alarm at what he describes as the formation of classes that are different in kind and in their degree of separation from anything that the nation has ever known. The divergence into these separate classes, if it continues, will end what has made America, America. Have you heard echoes of Brandeis? It echoes John Gardner and Mr. Murray. And that is where we are today, and that's the subject that I've tried to tackle in this book, how we became two Americas. And the truth of the matter is, the more I worked on the subject, the more the subject changed, the more the book changed underneath me. It's somewhat embarrassing to admit, I was doing research and reporting on a period when I had been running the New York Times Washington Bureau, and I was discovering things that I thought I knew or should have known. And every discovery moved me to a new conclusion and pushed me further. It's only natural. Reporters know their holes in their reporting. We don't have time to go back and fill in the holes and spot the trends. We're doing history on the fly, we're cutting in salami slices, and then we never get a chance to put the whole sandwich, the whole thing together. I don't know how many of you have read lots of books about Lincoln, but I've read several. And I'll never forget the impact on me of Doris Kearns' great book, Team of Rivals. What a genius idea to take these members who were in Lincoln's cabinet in the 1860s and go back to the 1820s, the 1830s, the 1840s, the 1850s, and see them evolve and see the politics of the nation evolve. So that when you got to 1860 and you saw Lincoln dealing with these people, saw him dealing with the Civil War, your whole understanding was enriched by that perspective. Well, I've tried to do something like that in going back and telling the long story. My conclusion, my belief is the problems we have today in America are the product of the last 30 or 40 years of our economics and our politics. And that our current political campaign, and indeed most of our current political journalism, isn't really helping us understand the nature of those problems because we're barely skating across the surface. Politicians in political years always walk on eggs. They always avoid the most important issues. I've covered a half a dozen presidential campaigns. They never go into the really tough stuff very hard. Why? Because they're going to alienate voters in the process, and they don't want to lose any voters. They just try to stake out a few positions and then try to build those coalitions that give them a majority and win office. But that's not the job of a journalist. As far as I'm concerned, the job of a journalist is to call the balls and strikes. Go back and try to figure out what the facts are, how the game went, was it played fairly, and what are the conclusions that we can come to for today. And when I did that, I kept coming across surprise after surprise after surprise. I didn't realize, I was always skeptical of trickle-down economics. But ladies and gentlemen, what we have had in the last 30, 40 years, it's not just a failure of trickle-down economics. We have had geyser-up economics. We've had a massive transfer of wealth from the middle class in this country to the super rich, to the wealthy, to Wall Street. The wealth has gone the other way. It's moved from middle to the top, and I'll tell you several ways in which. When I looked into the housing crisis, I found out that the main victims of subprime mortgages were people who deserved prime mortgages. There were people who were talked, cajoled, fooled, duped, cheated into loans they never should have taken out, and not once, but often repeatedly. I found out that before the housing bubble burst, the middle class, the homeowners in America had lost $6 trillion. And home equity is the bedrock wealth of the middle class in America. That money had moved from the middle class to Wall Street to big-time investors, all before the housing bubble busted. I'm going to try to tell you how. But one of the biggest surprises that I had was to discover that right under my nose some big changes had been taking place, and I'd seen the symptoms of them. I'd seen them play out a bit, but I hadn't understood what was really at work when I was there in Washington trying to run the New York Times Bureau. You know, it's interesting about history. History often has hidden beginnings. There's not always a mushroom cloud that tells you you've entered a new era. Sometimes we slip from one era into the next era without being aware we passed over the watershed. And only when we historians go back and sift through the evidence like detectives do they realize that something new has happened and there's been a change that affects that generation and the next generation and their children. And ladies and gentlemen, that's what happened to us in the 1970s, both in our politics and in our economics. One of the most interesting characters that I came across, that I was aware of as a character and as an important figure on the Washington scene, but not in the role that I discovered him in, was Lewis Powell. How many of you, does that ring a name, that bell ring a name with how many of you? Well, to me, Lewis Powell was a Supreme Court justice named to the High Court by Richard Nixon toward the end of 1971, and who served for the next 16 or 17 years. Often with a conservative majority. He was conservative, but also sometimes bridge in the middle of the court. He was a man who had been a corporate attorney. He came from Richmond, Virginia. He was part of the Virginia aristocracy, had a soft Tidewater drawl. Our Supreme Court reporter said that in the court he had a very modest, unassuming manner, that sometimes he would pat around the court in his slippers or soft shoes and his shirt sleeves, and when visitors from out of town, tourists, would come to the Supreme Court building, they would mistake him for a custodian and ask him for directions somewhere. Well, this mild-mannered man was not down deep mild-mannered. Lewis Powell was an ardent advocate of the free enterprise system. He was very strongly pro-business. And by the early 70s, Lewis Powell had become alarmed at what he thought was a potential mortal danger to the free enterprise system, that it was under assault from the trade union movement, AFL-CIO, it was under assault from Ralph Nader, the consumer movement, under assault from the environmental movement, and under assault, interestingly enough, from government regulation, from the Environmental Protection Agency, from OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, from the Mine Safety Board, from the Traffic Safety Commission, and so on and so forth. The irony is, although he never mentions Richard Nixon, in the famous memorandum which he wrote for the United States Chamber of Commerce, Powell never mentions Nixon. But the criticism of the government policies that he had was less against Lyndon Johnson and the Democrats than it was against Richard Nixon and the Republicans. Just one of those delicious ironies of history that lets you know that sometimes the politics that you expect gets scrambled in unusual ways. Anyway, Powell wrote this memorandum, and it was a corporate manifesto. It was a call to arms. This was a corporate Paul Revere, Lewis Powell. He said business should organize itself, that businesses small and large and in different industries should stop their internal feuding. They should fuse and combine and unite their political forces. They should move to Washington. They should go after their enemies aggressively. They should identify them, punish them, vote them out of office, and they should take the high ground. They should take control in political Washington. What's interesting is that happened. They took Lewis Powell very seriously. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce distributed the Powell Memorandum to lots of business leaders. Within 4 months, the Business Roundtable was formed by 150 of the largest and most important multinational corporations in the United States. And it is today the most powerful voice of business in Washington, political voice of business in Washington. And it's so much a fixture that it is impossible, literally, to remember the time when the Business Roundtable didn't exist. But it didn't exist before Lewis Powell said, get organized, get going. The National Association of Manufacturing, after the Powell memo, decided it better move its headquarters to Washington. The Chamber of Commerce doubled its staff, tripled its budget. The National Federation of Independent Businesses, the arm of small business in America, grew, mushroomed, skyrocketed from 4,000 members in 1971 to 600,000 members 8 years later. Tremendous growth. The number of companies that had lobbying offices in Washington grew from 175 at the time Lewis Powell wrote his memo to more than 2,400 a decade later. The number of people working for business trade associations by 1980 was 50,000. The number of registered corporate lobbyists was 9,000, and there were 8,000 more corporate public PR people. There were so many corporate lobbyists in Washington, by the end of the 1970s, they outnumbered each member of Congress 130 to 1. Now, I got to tell you, I was sitting there with a good 50-yard line seat to American politics. I was working very hard with a bunch of very good reporters, and we saw bits and pieces of this, but we didn't know something that big had happened. But we did know something had happened. How did we know something had happened? Because we began to see it show up in the political fights in Washington on the big issue. But here's another discovery. Most of us think of the big change in American politics back in the 80s as the time when Ronald Reagan was elected. In the election of 1980, when the Republicans took over control of the Senate for the first time in 34 years. And the Reagan Revolution, although there were many conservatives who said, including his own budget director, David Stockman, there was no Reagan Revolution politically. But what's interesting is it wasn't the Reagan years that were the turning point. The turning point actually occurred under Jimmy Carter and the Democrats in 1978. Go out of this room and remember that the 1978 Congress was the most pivotal Congress probably in our history, at least over the last 50 years. Pivotal because the direction and thrust of dominant American economic and political policy changed in that 1978 Congress. You can understand what the expectation was if you remember that 1974 was Watergate, Richard Nixon was out of office, the Democrats surged into Congress in the subsequent election with big advantages. People thought the Republican Party had been demolished by Watergate, and the Democrats were riding high, and the early 1970s had really been a sort of anti-business period, or at least a highly regulatory period, which business people like Lewis Powell thought was highly anti-regulatory. Richard Nixon was part of that. Richard Nixon was part of the belief in American politics, the bipartisan belief in American politics, that you had to regulate the excesses of capitalism to protect consumers, but also to make capitalism work better, so that major powers, major economic and financial powers within the competitive system didn't snuff out competition, that it was a good idea to have regulation that caused greater competition. So Ralph Nader saw the Democrats get elected and take over Congress in '76. And Jimmy Carter of the White House, and they said, aha, this is the time when we're going to get the Consumer Protection Agency that I have wanted all along. That bill never got out of the House. The business lobbyists ambushed that bill. And the AFL-CIO said, well, this is the Congress in which we're going to get the labor law, what they call labor law reform, legislation that rolled back Landon Griffin and Taft-Hartley and other legislation that put a clamp and a damper on the organizing prospects and abilities of labor. We're going to reverse those laws, and we're going to get what we've been waiting for a long time. They got that legislation out of the House, but it got filibustered in the Senate, and it never passed the Senate. So these business lobbyists ambushed effectively both the consumer movement and the labor movement. But they weren't content with beating the opposition. There were things they wanted. One of the things that Xerox and Kodak wanted was the 401k. The 401k, I don't know if you all know why it's called a 401k. Does anybody have any question about why it's called? 400 provisions in the tax code is all the way down. It's in the 401st paragraph of the tax code, and it is so far down in that part of the tax code, it is the K provision. If there's anybody back there who can get me some water, I'm going to need it later. Can you help me with that? Thanks. So Kodak and Xerox wanted for their executives a tax shelter for deferred compensation. They went to a guy named Barbara Conable, who was the ranking Republican on the House Ways and Means Committee, an upstate Republican from New York, a moderate northern Republican, a very good congressman, very good legislator. I knew Barbara Conable well, respected him, liked him, and just as a favor for these two big corporations that happen to have their headquarters in his home district, Conable put it in the hopper. Nobody, I mean nobody other than Conable, his chief of staff, and probably the tax writing specialist on the Ways and Means Committee knew that it was there or had any idea why it was there. And certainly the press didn't, and the White House had no idea. It just sailed through invisibly, as, by the way, do many provisions in tax laws. So this was not unusual. There are all kinds of implications that I'll get to later on in the 401k, but the most important thing is the 401k program, as it later got adapted, shifted the burden of hundreds of billions of dollars a year from the backs of corporations onto middle-class individuals. It had a major impact, okay? The second thing that corporate America got in that legislative session of 1978 was a revision of the corporate bankruptcy laws. We're into the weeds here, but these are weeds that have enormous impact long-term. It's one of the reasons why they're so obscure often that it's very hard for lots of people to see them and to understand them, which is the reason I'm taking the trouble to try to put them together. Great, thanks. In the old times, prior to the 1978 corporate bankruptcy revision, when a company went bankrupt, they turned the management of that company over to what was called a bankruptcy referee. Somebody familiar with business but not involved in that business. And the reason for that is bankruptcy is painful. People are all going to get hurt financially. So the idea is you turn it over to a referee, you get somebody who's neutral, and the pain gets parceled out to the shareholders, to the managers, to the workers, to the creditors, to everybody. Maybe not exactly equally, but everybody shares in the pain. What that bankruptcy law did was it left the old management of the bankrupt company in charge of the bankruptcy process. So they could run the bankruptcy process. So when you start to see the bankruptcies of the airlines and the steel mills, United, Delta, now American, LTV Steel, Bethlehem Steel, Weirton Steel, and so on and so forth, and they go into the bankruptcy court, the shareholders take a hit. The stock is gone kaput. The creditors take a bit of a hit, but the trade unions and the workers take an enormous hit. Why? Management's in charge of the bankruptcy process. I happen to take the United Airlines bankruptcy as my case study in this particular field, and in that case, the workers, and we're talking pilots, stewards, airline mechanics, all kinds of people working for the airline, they lost roughly $4 billion worth of wages, health benefits, pension benefits, retirement benefits, and so forth. Tremendous hit. So there's another provision that cost the middle class a great deal in that 1978 session. And then another thing, which almost nobody noticed in that session, was there was a law passed that eliminated the ceiling on interest rates. Lots of states around the country, Illinois, Wisconsin, I can't remember whether Washington State had a usury law, but the states had usury laws. And they put a limit on the interest rate, that could be charged to people on their credit cards, on their mortgages, whatever, with the idea that you just can't have unbelievable interest rates. Well, the banks didn't like that. The banks wanted to have the lid blown off. Why? Because they wanted to be able to loan some people who were not such good risk, people who were subprime. And so if they could charge them, they figured if they could charge them 18 to 20% interest rates, and by the way, take a look at the interest rate on your credit card now. It wouldn't be where it was if it weren't for this law that I'm talking about that got passed in 1978, because most of us have credit cards that if you don't pay up, you can hit about 18, 20%. That's a pretty high interest rate. So that law got passed, and it blew the lid off interest rates, and it laid the foundation for the subprime crisis. So that's a third law, another area that's affected the middle class. And then the final law that I'm going to talk about is tax law. Always watch tax law. Tax law is always one of the great political indicators. There's a wonderful quote in my book from one of the best tax lawyers on Wall Street in one of those great white shoe law firms on Wall Street. And he said, very simply, the tax law is the most political law there is in America. And that's absolutely true. Tax law is not just about taxes. It's really about politics. Who has power? Who's having to give up power? Who's having to give up money? And who gets money? It's about winners and losers, tax law. So in this particular case, Jimmy Carter in 1976 had run on the campaign slogan that America had a tax law was, do you remember the phrase? A disgrace to the human race. That was his slogan. So Carter came in, and what he was going to do with the tax law was he was going to eliminate some of the loopholes of the people at the top end of the income scale so that they had to pay a larger share of taxes. He was also going to close some corporate tax loopholes, and he was going to drop some people at the lower end of the income scale from the tax rolls. By the way, Richard Nixon had done that only 3 or 4 years before, and he went much further as a Republican than Jimmy Carter intended to do. Jimmy Carter was going to do a little modest add-on to what Nixon had done and others had done. So the tax law goes up to Capitol Hill from the White House, and it comes back about as fast and as hard as a highlight ball that's been thrown against that hard ball and comes slamming back in the opposite direction. That is exactly what happened to Carter. Carter was not one of the great legislative maneuvers among the presidents that I've covered, so some kind of shortfall would be expected, but not what happened in this one. What happened in this one is the loopholes at the upper end of the tax law were not closed, either for corporations or for individuals. The corporate tax rate was dropped, only 2%. But over the last 40 years, the corporate tax rate had only gone up, it hadn't gone down. This is the first time it went down. The people on the lower end of the income scale were not dropped from the tax rolls, and the capital gains rate, which affects all investors, but is principally important to investors of considerable size and considerable wealth, was cut from 48% to 28%. It's now down to 15%. Just remember, under Jimmy Carter, more than half of the cuts that have taken place in the last 50 years happened in that one Congress. So while we're having things that are going to hit the middle class later on, we just had something big that is going to help the wealthy. So that's what happened in that Congress. I remember talking afterwards. Now, I saw some of those things, okay? We reported, though, some of that legislation. We didn't report the 401k. We didn't even know it was in there, I'll be honest with you. But we didn't understand, I didn't understand, neither did my colleagues understand, that there had been this power shift that had been triggered by the Lewis Powell Memorandum. And let me tell you, one of the first talks I've given about my book, I gave at the home of Mark Shields in Washington, the Washington Post columnist who appears on the Friday night PBS show, the PBS NewsHour. I told the same story about Lewis Powell to a group of about 40 or 50 good Washington journalists, including Mark Shields, including Bob Schieffer of CBS, including Jim Lehrer, including a whole bunch of other guys. There was only one of them who had ever heard of Lewis Powell and the Lewis Powell Memorandum. So that's how big a discovery that was for me, how big a discovery that was for those guys, and I hope how big a discovery it is for you. That was a power shift of enormous importance. And I asked Arthur Levitt, a friend of mine, who also happened to go to Williams College, about a couple of these victories that we had seen that had taken place without being fully aware of why it had happened. And Levitt said to me, he was then head of the president of the American Stock Exchange, he said to me, well, business discovered that it can get what it wants if it goes after it. Business has tasted power, and it's going to want more power. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we have been living with that legacy for the last 30 or 40 years. There is today in Washington a group that savvy political reporters call the Gang of Six. Now, if you turn your television set on and you listen very carefully, you're going to hear the Gang of Six referred to as 6 bipartisan senators in the Senate who were trying to get a bipartisan solution to the debt crisis. God bless them, I hope they can succeed. But the Gang of Six with real power is the Business Roundtable, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the National Association of Manufacturing, the National Federation of Independent Business, the National Association of Wholesalers and Distributors, and the National Association of Restaurateurs. And the guy who actually maneuvers this is a guy whose name you would never know. This is the modern counterpart to Lewis Powell. George Bush, when he signed the tax cut of 2003, the third major tax cut that he had signed in his presidency, in the glittering chandeliered East Room of the White House, stood up and he thanked members of his cabinet, he stood up and he thanked committee chairmen and leaders in the Congress, and he thanked my friend Dirk. You have never heard of Dirk. Dirk never appears in the news. Dirk never appears on television. Dirk has held no elective office. Dirk has never had an elective office. Dirk was the first guy Karl Rove had lunch with after George Bush outside the White House. He's the first guy Karl Rove had lunch with after George W. Bush's inauguration in 2001. And who is Dirk? Dirk is the head of the National Association of Wholesalers and Distributors, and he is the field marshal of the Gang of Six. He's the guy who makes sure the votes get delivered when the Gang of Six wants to get the job done. So there you got 2 stories, and we got a connection between the 2000 era. Dirk Van Dongen was fighting Barack Obama in 2009, 2010, 2011 about whether or not to increase the taxes on the wealthy. And guess who prevailed? So keep your eye on Dirk if you can find anybody who will tell you about him except Hedrick Smith, okay? All right, so that was an enormous power shift. It was a game changer. You know, there are things that happen in politics and the psychology of politics that are very much like what happens in the momentum and the psychology of sports. You're watching the finals of some great tennis match, and Federer is having a battle with his nemesis, another great Spanish player. I'm drawing a blank. Help me. Nadal. I don't want to miss that. Nadal. And they're in the 5th set. And Smith and Tucker have no idea where it's going to go. And they're 4-4. Federer serving. Nadal gets a service break. And you know it's over. Yes, they'll play it up, but you know the balance has shifted. It's tipped. It's gone in Nadal's favor. Isn't it wonderful? I can use his name even if I couldn't remember it. You know, or the same thing is true with the Seahawks. The same thing is true. You know, they get in a battle in the 4th quarter. It's a very tight game. Somebody throws a long pass. There's a completion. Psychologically, it blows the game apart. Or there's an interception. Or there's a fumble. That's what happens. That's what happened in 1978. There was a game changer. And not only did the reality of politics and power in Washington change, with enormous consequences for the American middle class and the American dream, but the psychology of politics changed along with it, and it rests with us today. And unless we change that psychology, we're not going to get a smart fix to the nation's problems. Now, what's really important is to step back from that for a moment and understand how big a change that was and why. Let me have a swallow of water for a moment here. Before that time, the middle class had exercised enormous power and influence on Washington. Think about it. Enough people in this room are old enough to remember it, and those of you who aren't, I'm going to try to fill in a few blanks. The environmental movement in 1970 was epitomized by Earth Day in April. 20 million Americans, almost 10% of the nation's population, were involved in some kind of protest or demonstration to express their outrage at the fouling of the nation's waters and the nation's air. They wanted to get rid of the smog over LA, clean up the Great Lakes, stop the flaming of the Cuyahoga River because so many chemicals had been dumped into it. They wanted action, and they demanded action. And 1971, Richard Nixon, who was no tree-hugging environmentalist, believe me, He sets up the Environmental Protection Agency. Russell Train just died. Recently, he was the first head of the Environmental Quality Council in Nixon's White House. Nixon felt compelled to do this by popular pressure. Think about that. Nixon felt compelled to do this by popular pressure. Fast forward to today. What president felt compelled to do what by popular pressure? Now you understand how different the power situation is, okay? Civil rights movement. Martin Luther King and gang, and I followed him through my reporting down in Albany, Georgia, and Birmingham, Alabama, and Gadsden, and all over the place, and the March on Washington, which is one of the most inspiring days of my life, and certainly the lives of many people. And it expanded the American dream. It expanded the American dream because ordinary blacks and lots of whites who sympathized with them, lots of middle-class people and their kids, and lots of middle-class kids and their parents said, this is intolerable. We're not going to stand for this anymore. Everybody remembers that soaring, anguished refrain of Martin Luther King. I have a dream, I have a dream. That someday little white boys and little white girls and black girls will be able to sit, my daughters will be able to sit down with people of the other race. But the great comment that he made, was we have come here to Washington to cash in a promissory note from American democracy. Almost brings tears to my eyes. That all men, yes, black men as well as white men, are entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What a moment. Why do we have a moment like that now? What a moment. The dream, the American dream, is expanding. The middle class is demanding it. And within a year we get the Civil Rights Act that opens up public accommodations, and within 2 years we get the Voting Rights Act that gives blacks and other minorities protections for their voting, which are now under assault, by the way. But that happened. That happened. The consumer movement. Ralph Nader writes the book, Unsafe at Any Speed, and he says General Motors and other automakers are building cars with defects that are causing accidents that are killing people. This is intolerable. And we get a flood of consumer protection legislation. It happened. Women's movement. Women still don't get equal pay with men, but it's a lot better thanks to the women's movement of that time. The labor movement. Labor movement back at that time was powerful and was the absolute anchor of the middle class standard of living. It's embodied a thing called the Treaty of Detroit. The Treaty of Detroit in 1948 between General Motors and the United Auto Workers was a declaration of peace in the auto industry after a slew of wildcat strikes, which is why General Motors wanted it. But it enshrined the American dream. Solid jobs, steady pay increases, health benefits, and for the first time, retirement. And why did industry like retirement? It meant they didn't have to pay the money to the labor unions now. They could pay it later on. So there was a cash advantage. There was a cash flow advantage to the captains of industry from that. They thought it was a good deal. And the idea spread. Spread to Ford, spread to Chrysler, spread to U.S. Steel, spread to the rubber workers, the atomic workers. It spread to many non-union companies. As a matter of fact, many millions more of non-union workers got the benefit of those union contracts. And that undergirded, that supported, that was the foundation of the rising living standards of the American middle class that was characterized of the era of the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. Do you remember 1959, Richard Nixon goes to Moscow, and he gets in a kitchen debate in the American exhibition in Moscow with a whole bunch of kitchen appliances with Nikita Khrushchev, the head of the communist company, the country, the prime minister of a communist society who claimed to have the road to a classless society. And what does Richard Nixon say to Nikita Khrushchev? We have achieved a classless society. And that's what we believe, and that's what we've done. We've come so much closer to it than anybody else in human history. That's the era that economists call the Great Convergence. What they mean by that is that salaries and incomes and the wealth at the top and at the middle and at the bottom are closer together. They converge instead of diverging. What we have now is the Great Divergence. What we had then was the Great Convergence. Now, I don't know whether or not you've noticed what I've just done, but I slipped from politics and political power into economics. And the reason I was able to do that, and why it's important, is that politics and economics go hand in hand. The great era of middle-class prosperity was in fact underpinned by middle-class power, by the exercise of middle-class power. Terribly, terribly important. We had at work a thing that economists call now the virtuous circle of growth. Henry Ford got the idea, others did too, but it's most easily captured in Henry Ford's idea of the $5 day. Long before the year I'm talking about, Henry Ford started producing Model T cars, what, in 1908, 1909, and the $5 day didn't come until 1914 when Ford was having trouble hiring workers and keeping them. But Ford said the $5 day is not only fair, it not only gives the workers a better share of the earnings of the corporation and the growth of the economy, it's smart business. If we pay them more, they'll buy more. If they buy more, they can buy Model Ts. We can sell more Model Ts. Flash forward now to this period of middle-class prosperity after World War II, the same thing's going on. The virtuous circle of growth is paying lots of middle-class people under the Treaty of Detroit and its copycat agreements elsewhere in the economy, paying them well. They go out and spend the money by the tens of millions of people. That generates enormous consumer demand. The consumer demand forces industry to build new plants, buy new equipment, hire more workers, and then starts the next cycle. I don't mean to suggest that the economy didn't go up and down. There were business cycles there, but if you look at the path, the trajectory over that period, it's steadily going up. Now, I just told you something very important that is critical for you to walk away from this talk with. Consumer demand is the driving power of the American economy. Economists will tell you it accounts for 70% of the driving force of the American economy. Consumers, yourselves, you are the job creators. Don't let anybody tell you that it's a bunch of people with a lot of money are the job creators. We need capital to run businesses, yes. But for the last 4 years, business has been sitting on about $2 trillion worth of capital, and they have not been hiring. So capital isn't the problem. That's not the shortage. The shortage is demand. When we had the good era of middle-class prosperity, we had high pay, high consumer demand, and high growth. And now we have low pay, low consumer demand, and low growth. And it is getting worse. It is not just now. If you go back and look at the economic development of the last 30 or 40 years, prior to 1990, it used to take roughly 21 months on average for the economy to go from the bottom of a recession back to the point where employment or unemployment was at the same level as it was before the economy spilled into the recession. With the recession of the early 1990s, it took 26 months. With the recession of the early 2000s, 2001, 2002, 2003, it took 46 months. With this recession, we've been in it 41 months and we'll be lucky to get out of it without 60 or 70 months. Now, what does that tell you? What that tells you is something wrong structurally that goes beyond the political arguments we are having now about whose fault it is, whether or not we grew fast enough or not. This is not to say we couldn't have done better or there aren't smart policies, but it is to say that there's something structurally wrong. And what's structurally wrong is the middle class is not sharing adequately and not sharing fairly in the growth of the country and the profitability of the corporations. This is one more set of numbers that you need to remember. From 1945 until 1973, the productivity of the American workforce, which along with demand is the driver of growth and prosperity, roughly doubled. It grew 97%. The wages and salaries of the average American workers, and I'm not talking just assembly line workers, I'm talking about grocery people, grocery store people, and pharmacy people, and plumbers, and electricians, and small business people, people with 7-Eleven stores, and that kind of stuff. Their wages, their salaries grew 95%. 97% growth in productivity, 95% growth in their standard of living, because their wages and their salaries are their standard of living. Now here's the dividing line. And notice the dividing line is very close to the power shift, okay? What happened was from 1973 to 2011, that productivity curve kept going up, 80%. The average wage, the average compensation, wage plus benefits of the average worker went up 10%. 80% up, 10%. So I'll try to draw these graphs for you. So if you're looking at productivity, it's going like this, and it's going like this. And if you're looking at pay, it's going like this, and it's going like that. And in fact, the Census Bureau put out a report last year that said the wage of the hourly wage of the average male worker, and it's very important to look at the male worker because if you look at household income, it is affected by the fact that not only more women went to work, but more women worked more hours. So if you look at household income, you can't tell exactly what's going on in the insides of the economy. But if you look at just male workers, what you discover is, and what they reported was, the hourly pay of the average male worker in 2011 was just a shade lower, adjusted for inflation, than in 1978. 78 to 2011, 3 decades of going nowhere. Now that's what I call wedge economics, because the economies continue to grow, and the profitability, productivity has continued to grow, and the profitability of corporations has continued to grow. In fact, during that period, the profits of corporations rose roughly 13% a year on average, and the average wage rose less than 1% a year. So where did all that money go? Upward. Upward. The income of the top 1% increased 600%, sixfold in that same period. So while middle America is going flat, the top is multiplying by sixfold. This is before taxes. And then the tax system tilted it even more. That's wedge economics. So the two things that really fundamentally have undermined, unraveled, and stolen the American dream, and there are other aspects to it besides these, but the two things that have done it are the power shift, which has tilted policy heavily in favor of the powerful and the rich, and the powerful being often corporations, and the rich, and the wage economics that have cut the middle class off from its share of the gains. I'm not saying the people at the top shouldn't have had their share of the gains, but had we continued the same distribution of income and the way it was distributed in the post-war period, in the next 30 years, every year the bottom 80% of this country would have gotten $750 billion more in income every year. And the top 1% would have got $673 billion less. So that's telling you what the heck has happened in between. The housing thing that I mentioned before simply adds on to that. The housing thing to me is particularly troubling because of something it says to me about what's happened to the ethos in America. What's happened to the ethos in business in America. And before I get to housing, I want to talk about the business ethos a little bit more closely. If you go back to that era of middle-class prosperity, and you talk to Frank Abrams, who was the CEO of Standard Oil of New Jersey, the ExxonMobil of today, talk to Charlie Wilson, the CEO of General Motors, talk to Reginald Jones, the CEO of General Electric, and they would tell you, and they did, and I've got quotes in the book, they would tell you that the job of the CEO was to further and further promote, support, and balance off the interests of the stakeholders in the corporation. Now that word is very important, stakeholder. It's not shareholder, stakeholder. And what do they mean? They meant the groups of people who had a stake in the success of the corporation. Managers, owners, of course, but employees, suppliers, customers, the communities they lived in. They articulated that. That was the ethos of the era. The CEO didn't walk off, the management didn't walk off with the lion's share of the gains. They spread them around. That was good business. That's what people believed in. But that changed. We have a different ethos now, and the ethos is basically characterized by the slogan, shareholder value. Think about what shareholder value really means. It means boosting the price of the stock. Now, sometimes you do that with good performance. Sometimes you do that by talking it up. Sometimes you actually do that by cheating, and there are lots of people who cheated on shareholder value. It was the pay-for-performance idea. Pay the executives, pay the CEO in large chunks of stock. Now, they don't grant, in big corporations, they don't grant 100 stock options or 1,000 stock options or 10,000 stock options. They grant 1 million stock options. The CEO's done had a really good year, give them 1 million stock options. In fact, Larry Ellison, the CEO of Oracle, frequently gets 7 million stock options a year. One year he got $700 million worth of stock options. $700 million in 1 year. Michael Eisner at Disney got 400. The Wall Street Journal ran a table of stock options derby, and Eisner was at the top. Eisner was second, and Ellison was first. Poor Sandy Weill, he had only 3 years where he sort of hit 200 million a year. And so, you know, you're getting that. Charlie Wilson, who in the 1950s ran General Motors, the largest corporation in America, made $600,000 a year. Now translate that, move forward by inflation, $5 million a year in contemporary dollars. I mean, Charlie Wilson, it's like he's running a corner drugstore by today's standards. And we've just totally lost any sense of reality here. Remember, this is while the middle class, with the average wage is flat. This is what wedge economics is all about. So we're talking about how we're going to get somewhere. One of the things we got to do is put more money in people's jeans and people's pocketbooks. And there are all kinds of ways of doing that. We can talk about that later if you want to. It's very important to understand that one of the reasons why this has happened in this era is that just as in the era of middle class power and prosperity, politics and economics go hand in hand. The same thing is true in the era of hyper-concentration of wealth and hyper-concentration of power. We have a starkly unequal democracy. At the same time, we have starkly unequal incomes in America. That's where a lot of our basic problems lie. Now, what are we going to do about it? Now, this is the touchy part. My editor said to me, and I haven't told you all the stories I can, there are more in the book, and if you want to ask about them, we can. But my editor, Kate Medina, said to me, Rick, you can't tell people all these stories that you've just done about wedge economics and the power shift and the Gang of Six and Lewis Powell, and not help them out, tell them what we're going to do about it. I said, hey, I'm a reporter. My job is to tell you the story, is to go find the facts, is to analyze them, is to lay it out to you. It's up to the politicians and the policy wonks and the policy makers that tell the policies. She said, no, Rick, you got to do it. I said, you got to do it. She said, it's not fair. You got to do it. And I said, Kate, I'm really uncomfortable with that. And Susan, who was my first editor, this lady sitting right over here, said, Rick, you got to do it. I did it. I did it. Susan said I got to do it. I got to do it. So you've got at the back of this book Hedrick Smith's handy-dandy 10-step path to utopia. I'm joking about it, and it's no joke. I had a real struggle doing this, but I think it was, in fact, the right thing to do. Ladies and gentlemen, the truth of the matter is, it is not hard to come up with a bunch of sensible ideas for helping us dig our way out of this ditch. We have a tax code, the corporate tax code in America, which charges corporations who keep jobs in America, Costco, trucking companies, hotel companies, restaurants, all kinds of people in all kinds of business that do their business inside the United States, we charge them much more in taxes than we do the multinationals that make a lot of their profits overseas. They don't have to pay taxes on their profits overseas until they bring them back to the country, and usually they're so powerful they can go lobby Congress, and instead of paying the 35% tax rate that the guys at home have to pay, they get what is called a tax holiday, and they only have to pay 5% on that. If they have to pay at all, sometimes they just go ahead and invest it. Money they make in China, they may invest in India or Malaysia or Indonesia or someplace else, okay? It's nuts. I mean, why do we do that? We should have people marching in the streets saying, let's at least make the corporate tax system fair. Maybe bring the rate down. I'm not necessarily advocating higher taxes. Maybe bring it down on the people who keep the jobs at home, and you just say these people who ship jobs overseas, no more. No out. Interesting. I hadn't thought about this before. This just came to me. You know, George Romney said the other day that half of the people, 47% of the people, don't pay any taxes. Well, in fact, that's not correct. He had his numbers a little bit wrong. 28% of those people actually work, but they make so little money they don't hit the minimum threshold for paying taxes. It says something about how we're paying people. It's pretty low. It's about $10,000. 10% of those people are on retirement. And they can reasonably say, I work my lifetime, I'm entitled to my Social Security and Medicare. So if we got any welchers, it's down about 8 or 9%, and I'm not even sure that's true. But what's really interesting is, and I'm trying not here to talk about Romney per se, and the politics of this campaign, but 78 major American corporations made profits, billions of dollars in profits between 2008 and 2010, and paid zero taxes. ExxonMobil, Wells Fargo, Merck, Goldman Sachs, and my favorite is General Electric. General Electric in those 3 years made $10 billion in profits. And guess what? They got a $4.5 billion tax rebate from the federal government. It's not a laughing matter. It is ironic. So we can do something about the tax system. All right. What about housing? What about housing? The Wall Street banks and the big banks got bailed out to the tune of something like $700 billion. had to do it. They're back to making money, the executives are back to getting their bonuses. And when we go to them, when the Obama administration or when Congress or when anybody goes to them and says, okay, how about helping out the homeowners who are stuck in houses that are worth less than their mortgage and who have interest rates that come out of the bubble era like 8 or 9%. And today the interest rates are 3 or 4%, 3.5%, 4%. Why don't you refinance those? Well, maybe we should say, you must refinance those. And guess what would happen? Those people would spend $500, $1,000, $1,500 a month less on their mortgages. And most of them are pretty hard pressed, and they'd spend that money. What does that say to you? It says to me, consumer demand. Probably $700, $800 billion worth of consumer demand would be freed up by that. And it would also be fair, and it would break the logjam in the housing market. I could go on. In fact, I do in the book. But what's really important to me, and what I think is really essential, is the most maverick idea of all. And my colleagues in Washington who are smart and savvy say that I'm a fool and an idealist, but I'm going to say it anyway. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a moment of truth for American democracy. If we're unhappy with the way things are going, if the middle class has taken it in the chops and done badly, then it's time for us to make ourselves heard. It is not enough. You have to vote. You have to participate in the vote. That is the bedrock of democracy. But it is not adequate to vote. It's what happens after the vote that counts. Washington is a swarm with lobbyists. And as soon as the votes are counted and the new people are in office, the lobbyists go to work to undo what the voters just did. If you look at opinion polls, 80%, repeatedly, 80% of the American public will say lobbyists should be controlled, they should be prevented from making political contributions. There are all kinds of stuff about lobbyists. Something like 60 to 70% of the people will say in poll after poll that tax rates on the people at the top should be raised. Guess what? Congress doesn't pay any attention to that. There are all kinds of things that you can find in polls, and they don't happen in Washington. And people will say, with good reason, Washington doesn't listen to us. Well, the answer is, voices aren't enough. There's organized money. There's the Gang of Six. There's the Powell Army on the other side, and they go to work as soon as the vote is over. And they work very effectively. Anybody who tells you government doesn't work is not paying attention. Government works very well for the people who put the money and the effort into it. They get it to work for them. So if you want government to work for the middle class, you want the government to work for you, then you or we have got to go insist on it. Now, we can't insist on it by money. We don't have anywhere near as much money as they do, right? The only way to match organized money is with organized people. The only way to go is the same way Martin Luther King and company went on a March on Washington, August 28, 1963. We have come to cash in a promissory note from American democracy that all men, all women, all people of all classes are entitled to the same shot at life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Not the same outcome, but the same shot. And the playing field is no longer equal. The playing field is tilted. What has to happen in American democracy today is two things. Number one, we got to change the operative pronoun. As long as we're talking about American democracy, we say they have to fix it. It ain't going to get fixed. They're not going to do it. They're going to keep doing what they've been doing. The operative pronoun has to change from they to we. When we start saying we've got to do something about it, we keep saying it to each other, and then finally Jane says to Harry, we got to do something about it. Harry says to Phil, what are we going to do about it? And then Phil says to me, Mary, let's sit down and figure out what we're going to do about it. Is it going to be housing? Is it going to be taxes? Is it going to be something else? We got to go make a demand. We got to go sit in the meetings of the congressman or a congress member who comes back to our place. The Tea Party's already shown. The Tea Party's shown how to do it. There's only one problem with the Tea Party. They're not populists. The majority of Tea Party representatives elected to the House of Representatives in 2010 are millionaires. 33 of the 60 are millionaires. The average net worth of the Tea Party members of the House of Representatives is $1.8 million. They are not going to be after a middle class agenda. The middle class has got to go get it themselves. The answer is, we have got to do what Rosa Parks did on that famous day in 1955. We are not going to the back of the bus. Thank you.
can have my seat.
I'm going to pass a microphone.
Actually, let's try it.
Okay. Well, I'm sure there's some disagreement, so.
On? Is this one on? Okay. Okay.
Rick, you spoke a lot in macro terms, so the obvious question, at least to me, following what you told us, is if all this is true, why do we have such a close polled election? Are all these people missing the story?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you should leave it on, because you're going to be doing this all the time. You want to make it work? I don't care. Yeah, absolutely. A lot of people are missing the story. There's no question about it. That's one of the reasons why I wrote the book. I mean, I really believe that people do not understand what has happened, how it has happened, why it has happened, what the forces are that are at work, and there are folks who don't want them to understand what's happened. I mean, there's a lot of smoke being blown at people, and there are obviously people who disagree, and they're smart people, and I'm not saying I've got a monopoly on the truth here, but I do think that there are a lot of people who are not looking at their own economic self-interest, and it may be that their religious self-interest or their social self-interest, whether or not there's gay marriage or there's abortion or there's prayer in the schools or whatever, that they consider that more important than their economic self-interest. So there are, a certain number of people who are going to make that choice otherwise. But there are obviously lots of people out there who are doing very well under this system, and they're going to keep pushing for it. And they're spending hundreds of millions of dollars to make sure that other folks don't understand. Yeah, I think it's absolutely true that a lot of people don't get what's going on.
Jay, does his work also, do you think?
We can try it, but there might be an issue.
Okay. What do you think about egalitarian social democracy as something that has had a lot of success in the last 60 years as compared to the model that we have in this country?
What do you mean by that? Give me an example.
I mean, countries like Germany and Norway and countries that have very large social safety nets but low unemployment, sound economies, they do a stakeholder system.
That's a great question, and you caused me to reinsert something that I forgot in my speech. The Germany is a particularly good example. We're told that most of the outcomes that we're facing and the divisions of incomes that we're facing in America are really the result of impersonal market forces that are irresistible, that this is progress in action. This is Schumpeter's famous phrase, creative destruction of capitalism. That is technology and globalization, and there can't be much done about it. And furthermore, we're facing low wages in China and in India, and a high rising skill of technology and technical skills in those countries. Well, if you want to take a quick look to see whether or not that's something that makes sense, take a look at Germany. This lady is absolutely correct. They have a strong social contract there. There's a great sense of collaboration between management and labor. In fact, labor representatives sit on the boards of many, if not most, of the large corporations in Germany. And what's really striking is that since 1985, the wages of the average German worker have risen 5 times faster than the wages of the average American worker. Now, we're told by American corporations they can't possibly increase wages because they couldn't compete globally. In fact, Caterpillar just had a record year with record profits, $4.9 billion in 2011, and it imposed a wage freeze on its workers in its plants in Peoria and throughout the Middle West. They said they couldn't afford to pay more. By the way, that $4.9 billion profit's going somewhere, and we know where it's going. It's going to shareholders, it's going to the top executives. But the Germans have split it a different way. They have protected their middle class with these rising wages. And then so some people say, well, if they've done that, then the country must be suffering. The country must be doing badly economically in global trade. Well, in fact, if you look at the last decade, the United States had a trade deficit cumulatively from 2000 to 2010 of $6 trillion. We bought $6 trillion more Chinese, Indian, German, whatever stuff than we sold to the rest of the world, including high-tech stuff. We have a high-tech trade deficit as well as a regular trade deficit. Germany had a $2 trillion trade surplus. So they did very well in the world market. And so Daimler-Benz and BMW and those companies are doing fine. And then finally they have 21% of their workforce in manufacturing, and we have 9%. So that's the backbone of good middle-class jobs, and you better take the money.
There was a recent review in the New York Review of Books of your work that said the changes you described are well documented, but the reviewer didn't feel that you demonstrated the causal effect of the group of six and other business organizations producing the changes you described. Could you comment on that?
Wow, you're ahead of me. I haven't even seen that article. I've been on the road. I said you're way ahead of me. I haven't even seen that article. I didn't know there was a review yet in the New York Review of Books, so I'm delighted they had something to say. I don't know what to say because I haven't seen the argument in any detail, but I don't agree. I mean, I think you can see that the tax reductions for the wealthy that have been enacted under the pressures of the Gang of Six and its predecessors over the last 30 or 40 years have added something like $4 trillion to the wealth of the top 1 or 2% in this country. And that has increased the inequality of incomes in this country. And the denial of those rising wages by the corporations run by many of the people represented by the Gang of Six have denied the middle class its share of income. Without seeing it in detail, I don't know how to answer any better than that. And I don't know if that satisfies you, but that's the best I can do at the moment.
You briefly mentioned offshoring of U.S. jobs, particularly manufacturing jobs. I think it was in the context of tax advantages. But I feel that's more at the core of what's happening. And it's not just a tax matter. It makes U.S. workers have to compete against very low-wage workers in other countries. Could you say more about the role of offshoring of U.S. manufacturing jobs in this whole makeup?
Well, there's no question that the offshoring of jobs from America has hurt the middle class terribly. There are a variety of estimates around. A guy named Rob Scott, who's an economist at the Economic Policy Institute, estimates that something like 3 to 3.6 million jobs in America have been lost to China over the last 15 years or so. What's interesting is that we tend to focus almost exclusively on the wage differential between China and the United States. And from my reading, it may be true that in the early years of the movement of American jobs by American corporations to China were in fact caused by wage differentials. I'm talking about 84, 85, 86, 87. That was a time when China had devalued its currencies, which made the wage differential more dramatic. At a time when Japan, Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong increased the value of their currencies under pressure from the Reagan administration. But if you talk to industrialists now, they will tell you the main reason they're moving to China is two things. Number one, the subsidies, enormous subsidies from the Chinese government. Craig Barrett, a former CEO of Intel, said, I can build a modern chip fabrication plant $1 billion cheaper in China than I can in America. They get either free land or almost cost-free land. They get roads, they get electricity, they get water, they get power, they get all kinds of stuff, which is crucial to setting up a plant. And that, according to Craig Barrett, is much more important than the wages.
Rick, I'm wondering if we're between a rock and a hard place. I'm thinking about the steady state economy. And you mentioned putting money in consumers' pockets and that consumerism drives the economy. I absolutely agree. But if we put that money in the pockets, I'm wondering with China coming online and consuming a lot of basic resources, copper, cement, iron, oil, etc., is there more room for growth in the world, or are we hitting this steady state where people are not going to be able to need or afford as much as the previous century when we had a time of abundance.
Well, the number of new products is endless. I mean, as we can tell from Apple and Google. I'm sorry. If we were to spend $5 trillion over the next decade modernizing our infrastructure, which the U.S. Chamber of Commerce says would save us about $1 trillion, gain us about $1 trillion in foreign trade, you'd put a lot of people to work. Those people have money, they spend it, business expands. I mean, I think those dynamics are unchallengeable. The notion that we've reached a steady, non-growing state just simply doesn't cover other countries, like Germany. So I don't see why that should be the outcome. What we lack is consumer demand. Keynesian economics, whether or not people like it, has worked again and again. And you use Keynesian economics at the time when private sector demand is insufficient. 80% of the economists in this country, answering a poll from the Congressional Budget Office, agreed with the CBO's report that the stimulus package created or saved 3 million jobs in this country. Another stimulus package would do the same. But at the moment, there's political resistance to that. That isn't economics, that's politics. Let's see what we can do, I'm sorry.
Okay, I think we'll have one more question and then wrap it up. One more question? Anybody have another question?
Sir, do you see this opening gambit, this attack or presentation or focus that Obama's making now on challenging China with their subsidies? Do you see that as possibly an opening gambit to some more pressure against China for these subsidies? To get back to that question that Jay asked.
People are starting to feel as though the Chinese are not only behaving like a mercantilist economy, but they're overdoing it, they've overplayed it, and it's time for us to... The trade union movement has been pushing for this, understandably, for quite a while, and privately, we know that American corporate leaders have gone to Obama. They went to him before he last met with President Hu when Hu Jintao was in Washington about a year ago, and asked him to press the Chinese to stop this. The Chinese have a policy called indigenous innovation, which puts enormous pressure and actually a demand on foreign companies not only to produce in China, but to innovate in China, to move their research and development facilities to China. And businesses don't like that, but they're all scared of taking the Chinese on individually, and so they don't dare do it. And the Chamber of Commerce doesn't even dare do it collectively. So they went to Obama and said, will you do it? And Obama did, but Hu Jintao was on the way out, and I'm not sure it made a lot of difference. But it is terribly important that this be done, that this effort be sustained, and that we try to level the playing field. And I think that goes back to the question just before, that I think if those efforts are made, and the U.S. is joined by Germany and by France and by Japan, for example, and by other countries, and we make the Chinese play a little bit more by the rules that they agreed to play by, and that are the world rules, that too will bring jobs back. You know, there's an estimate, I mentioned offshoring of jobs. There's an estimate by the International Trade Commission, the U.S. International Trade Commission, that roughly 2 million American jobs have been lost by the theft by the Chinese of copyrighted designs. And we're not just talking software, we're talking about the designs of cars, we're talking about the designs of products. So there are a number of things there. I don't think we just need to go on a Chinese bashing campaign. That's not going to be helpful. But we do need to demand that the rules of the game are honored. I think my voice is back. I can take another one or two. Just a lot of that single malt.
I'm concerned about the need in our economy for sustained growth. How does that affect our environment? environment if consumers are buying things, we consumers are buying things we really don't need, using fossil fuel energy to produce them, and then they're ending up in landfills, 5-10 years later. Can we grow our economy without consuming things?
Did you all get all that? How do we balance off the demands of protecting the environment with the demands for growth? Is that roughly fair? That's a tough question, and it's particularly pertinent to someone like me because my last piece of work was about protecting the environment. None of these things are simply answered. And anybody who offers you simple answers is not really leveling with you. Obviously, we have to proceed with some care about the environment. We can't do things willy-nilly. It certainly behooves us to move in the direction of clean energy. But despite what the guy said in the New York Review of Books, the Gang of Six is going to make it very hard to, particularly the oil companies and the energy companies are going to make it very hard to move in the direction of growth of clean energy sources so that we can have both growth. And by the way, clean energy is a good example. We are coming up with the technologies in this country. We're inventing them. And as fast as we invent them, the production of them flies overseas. Why does it fly overseas? Because often it's very hard to get the seed capital fast enough. It has to do with speed. And so some people suggest that the government ought to step in and provide seed capital at the critical moment so that it attracts private capital and then step out of the game. You don't have to stay there. And other people say that's un-American, that's the government picking winners and losers, okay? In 1830, when Samuel F.B. Morse pioneered the telegraph system, he began with a $30,000 appropriation from Congress to help set up the first telegraph line from New York to Washington. So it ain't new. And what has to be done is done smart. You know, that we've got a bad example recently. And there's a risk that the bad example that we have is going to upset proceeding this way. But we can get the growth. There are lots of important things that people need. My God, think of this housing thing. People need good housing. People are being forced out of housing. Kids need education. They can't afford it. Look at the debt. Kids are being saddled with as they come out of college. There are all kinds of things we can do with our money. So I don't, it's being smart. It's being committed to a good balance. It's being intelligent and having a reasonable public debate about it instead of this ping pong game that doesn't get anywhere near the end. It's either got to be environment or it's got to be growth. It's got to be environment, it's got to be growth. One party says one, the other party says the other, and we don't get to any intelligent policy. I remember working in Germany on a documentary, I don't know, it was about 10 years ago, I think. And not surprisingly, iron and steel industry in the Ruhr Valley in northwest Germany was collapsing. It was happening all over the world. And what did the Germans do? The regional governments and the federal government in Germany began to put money in to help convert the old steel plants into new plants building environmental equipment, environmental converters, environmental scrubbers for industrial plants, and they moved ahead fast. The government didn't take over the industries. It wasn't socialized. It was, the conversion was speeded up so they were globally competitive. That's the kind of thing that can be done again and again and again if we get back to this notion that we can collaborate. That goes back to the earlier question, the social compact. The Germans hit the recession as we hit the recession. What do? German corporate leaders and German labor leaders sat down and agreed they didn't want to lay off millions of workers. So they came up with a thing called the short week. Now, their regular week is not 40 hours, their regular week is about 37 and a half. But they agreed that almost everybody would go from a 37 and a half hour week to a 30-hour week. Everybody would take some of the pain, and they wouldn't lay people off. And so you had people able to sustain their families. It's just an example of a collaborative, intelligent solution that you can get to if you don't have this kind of polarized, politicized dialogue about where you're going to go. And I would say the same thing can be true about the environment and growth. You need smart people, committed people, good people, and there are plenty of them on both sides, to sit down and try to work it out. They're not going to agree all the time. We are going to have problems, but we can move forward. And at the moment, we're just stuck. We can't move.
Okay, Donna, last question.
So I'm kind of thinking about Rosa Parks. You know, and and thinking about, okay, so this is great information, and you were rallying with your book, and here we are, kind of a David and Goliath kind of feeling. And so my question is more of, so now what? Taking on, it's about accountability with these corporations, getting the people in the White House, get the lobbyists out, get the people accountable to say, take care of us, get at the table. But I think in terms of organization, and how do we, Rosa Parks, all of us here, take a stand and get together? I mean, is there networks that might be connected to what you're doing right now that people can jump in and start to organize even a little bit more specific?
Yeah. Well, I suppose it's fair to say, Donna, that I did come here somewhat as a cheerleader, which is unusual for a journalist. I didn't come here to form the networks, but there's a guy named Van Jones who's got a movement called Take Back the American Dream. There are a group of people who are now beginning to organize a demonstration in Washington on the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, which will occur next August 28th. I just talked last night to some people who in Seattle told me that they had been exercised about health care, and they were talking about health issues, and they'd done it locally, and they demonstrated, and then they actually gone to the town meetings of some of the members of Congress that had come home and organized. I really think that in some ways the David and Goliath image is important, and what that says is start small. Rosa Parks didn't say she was going to overturn the system of segregation. She just said, what's going on in the buses here in Montgomery is unacceptable to me. So there's got to be, I can't believe there's not, something either in the San Juan Islands or in the state of Washington that's going on that's unacceptable. And I think part of what has to happen is people have to get the sense of engagement and success. I have a friend named Ernie Cortez. He's a Hispanic organizer. One of the best political, social organizers I've ever met in all my years of reporting all across America. He works down in Texas, Southern California, New Mexico, Arizona. And Ernie said to me at one point, he added to that famous adage of Lord Acton, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Ernie said, powerlessness also corrupts. It corrupts democracy at its very core. If we believe we can't do it, we can't do it. If we believe we can do it, we'll start to do it. And I think you have to start small. I think you can tell from my remarks, I'm pretty passionate about this. I got involved as a reporter writing this book. I'm scared stiff about where this country is. My book actually starts with Arnold Toynbee. Arnold Toynbee, the famous British historian who tells the story of human history through analyzing the rise and fall of 21 different civilizations. And he tells the story in terms of challenge and response. Ancient Egypt had the challenge of a very hostile environment, and its challenge was somehow to establish an effective system of agriculture down there in the Nile River Delta, and it did it effectively. And the same thing was true of the Incas and the Mayans in South and Central America. But there came an external challenge, the challenge of Spanish muskets. They fell before the Spanish muskets, and that was an external challenge that beat them. We all look back to ancient Greece and ancient Rome as kind of models for us. We learn about them in our history courses. It's interesting. Both of them were very powerful. The Greek city-states declined after they fell into fratricidal warfare over foreign trade. They fell to a problem and a challenge from within. Ancient Rome also fell to a challenge from within. We've been enormously successful in facing challenges from outside. We faced down the challenge from Hitler, Nazism in World War II, and we faced down the challenge of Soviet communism in the Cold War. I think we're now faced with a challenge from within. The challenges of division, the challenges of inertia, the challenges of the loss, the sapping of the strength and vitality of American democracy at the grassroots. I think if we don't meet that challenge, we're going to follow the other civilizations. And maybe that's inevitable at some point. But I don't really want it to happen on my watch, or my kids' watch, or my grandchildren's watch. I believe this country can recover. I believe people have got resilience and imagination and energy, and I think it can be done. And I'm not running for office because everybody's running for office got to tell you America's got a better day ahead. It ain't inevitable. America may not have a better day ahead, but it depends on us, and we got to do it. And with people like you, Donna, particularly with people like you, you've got the energy, you've got the imagination, and you've got a sense of how to organize stuff. People who can put together the Orca's Chamber Music Festival can do something pretty good in other areas as well. You know, and I think it is a real tough challenge we got to think about and do exactly what you said. You got to sit down and I hate to tell you, I would use the internet, but I'd avoid it too much because I think a lot of this stuff has got to start face to face. I think people have got to have a sense of connection and community and belief you can do something, and then go get other people. Doesn't mean you can't use the internet, but the minute you start depending on the internet, it starts going away. It drifts off. And the really good movements of the past didn't have the advantage or the disadvantage of the internet, and they achieved a lot. You are such a great audience, and it's such a thrill for me to have a chance to talk to you. And it's such a thrill for Susan and me to live on this wonderful island, not only because it's one of the most gorgeous places in the world, but because there's some of the most interesting, creative, dynamic people here. This is an endless source of our enjoyment, and it's an endless source of my confidence that this place could make a difference in what I'm talking about. Thanks.
Just a very brief announcement, the next Crossroads lecture will be David Kamen speaking on energizing the low-carbon future, another really important issue. Sunday, October 7th, 2 p.m. So thank you again so much for coming, and please join us at the bookstore. No, at the Orca Center. Yeah. Thank you.